The night had fallen quiet, save for the sound of the horses' hooves echoing on the gravel road. Remy Bradford had just finished his evening chores and sat on the porch of his farmhouse, staring out over the fields that stretched out into the distance. The air was crisp, the smell of autumn leaves filling the night. He was used to the solitude, the silence that had been his constant companion for the last 40 years. There had been days of hard work, moments of peace, but never anything to break the rhythm of his life. Not until tonight. He heard the unmistakable rattle of wagon wheels. It was late, well past midnight, and it was rare anyone would be traveling at this hour. He stood up from the porch swing, eyes squinting into the darkness, waiting for the figure to come into view. The soft glow of an oil lamp flickered in the distance, and as the wagon rolled closer, he recognized the silhouette of a woman. His heart skipped a beat. Arabella, his best friend, the woman who had been part of his life since they were 18. The woman who had never seemed to notice how much he loved her. As the wagon came to a halt, Remy stepped forward, concern lining his face. The horse slowed to a stop, and the driver, Arabella, dismounted shakily, her feet unsteady on the gravel. Remy's eyes scanned her face, catching the tremor in her hands and the dark circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted, her hair tangled, her clothes rumpled as if she had been on the road for hours. "Arabella," he asked, voice tight with worry. "What on earth are you doing here? Is something wrong?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed the lantern down on the ground, her gaze dropping to the trunk that sat next to her, packed with what seemed like all her belongings. A deep sigh escaped her lips, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, heavy with emotion. "I need you to marry me, Remy, as soon as possible." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Remy thought he might have heard her wrong. His heart pounded harder, but his mind couldn't make sense of what she'd just said. He stepped closer, trying to gauge if she was serious or if the exhaustion of the journey had made her delirious. "Marry you," he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "Arabella, what? Why?" He struggled to find words, his thoughts racing faster than he could speak. "What do you mean? What's going on? You can't just." She looked up at him then, her eyes full of an ache he hadn't seen in years. The tiredness was obvious, but so was something else, something deeper. "David," she said, her voice trembling. "David left me. The divorce, it was finalized 2 days ago." Remy's chest tightened at the mention of her husband's name. David Hayes had been the wealthy man Arabella had married all those years ago, the man who had seemed like the perfect match for her. Someone steady, someone who could give her everything she needed. Remy had accepted that. He'd watch her walk down the aisle to him, though his heart had broken silently day by day. But hearing her speak now, hearing the pain in her voice, made something inside Remy shift. He had never expected this, never expected Arabella to come to him like this. Not in the way she was now, broken and desperate. "There's more," Arabella continued, swallowing hard. "David's mother, she left me the estate. But there's a catch. The will says I have to remarry within a year of the divorce to inherit it. If I don't, the family can contest it. And they will. They'll claim I don't deserve it." Remy's mind reeled, trying to make sense of it all. He stepped closer, his heart now pounding not just for her, but for the gravity of the situation. The estate that had always been David's family's pride and joy. And now Arabella was here, at his doorstep, asking for a marriage that, to her, might seem like nothing more than a practical solution to an inheritance issue. But to him, to Remy, it was everything. His breath caught in his throat. 40 years. 40 years of quiet love, of standing by while she lived her life with someone else, of never daring to speak of the feelings he held deep inside. And now, she was here, asking him to marry her. Remy opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was frozen, caught between the man who had always loved her and the friend who had always promised to be there when she needed him. And now she needed him. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just looking for a solution. She was asking him for a lifeline. "Remy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know who else to turn to. You're the only person I trust. The only person who's never let me down." Her words struck him like a blow to the chest. Trust. That was what they had always shared, wasn't it? Years of friendship, of letters exchanged, of long talks, and quiet moments that no one else would ever understand. But trust didn't change what he had always felt for her. It didn't erase the love that had stayed hidden, buried under layers of friendship for far too long. He exhaled slowly, his mind spinning. What was he supposed to do? What could he say? Could he agree to this? Could he marry her and risk everything he had kept buried for all these years? He had never imagined she would come to him like this, in a way that would leave him with no choice but to say yes. He took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice steady but quiet. "You do the same for me," he said, hiding the truth of his feelings behind the words. She nodded, relief flickering across her face. He could see it now, the vulnerability in her eyes. She was asking him to save her, to step in and take a burden that no one else could bear. With a small, uncertain smile, she extended her hand, her fingers trembling as they reached for him. "Thank you, Remy," she whispered. He took her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin against his. And for a moment, nothing else mattered but the fact that she was here, asking him for something he had waited a lifetime to hear. "Let's do it," he said softly. "Let's get married." Remy whispered to himself as they shook hands. 40 years I've waited. And now you're here, asking for a marriage without love. God help me. I'll take whatever you can give." The morning sun crept gently across the horizon, spilling golden light over the wide fields surrounding Remy Bradford's farmhouse. The air was cool, touched with the scent of earth and hay. Arabella stirred awake in the small guest room, blinking against the light that streamed through lace curtains. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the memory of the night before came crashing back. The late-night journey, the desperate proposal, and Remy's quiet agreement to marry her. Her heart thudded with both gratitude and guilt. She sat up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from her travel-worn dress, her mind buzzing with disbelief. She was getting married today, to Remy. She inhaled deeply, the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting up the stairs. He was already awake. Of course he was. Remy had always been an early riser. Arabella dressed carefully, combed her hair, and descended the creaky wooden stairs. There he was, standing on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the sunrise stretch over his fields. His profile looked older in the morning light, the lines around his eyes deepened by time, but his expression was calm, peaceful. For a man about to marry his lifelong friend, he looked remarkably steady. "You're up early," she said softly. He turned, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've been up since dawn. Couldn't sleep much." She joined him on the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The silence between them was heavy with all the things they weren't saying. "Are you certain about this, Remy?" she asked finally, her voice uncertain. "It's not too late to change your mind." He took a slow sip of his coffee before answering, his tone calm, but full of meaning. Never been more certain. She didn't catch the double layer of truth in his words. Inside, his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and joy, the knowledge that after 40 years, the woman he loved would soon carry his name, even if only in name. After breakfast, they began preparing for the day. Arabella opened her trunk, pulling out a simple cream-colored dress. It was modest but elegant, something she had brought long ago for special occasions. Her hands shook slightly as she laid it across the bed. Meanwhile, Remy stood in his small bedroom, opening the drawer of his old wooden dresser. Inside lay his father's wedding ring, a simple gold band, polished smooth by years of wear. He turned it over in his hand, remembering how his parents had loved each other through good times and bad. They had built a life together from scratch, and their love had endured everything. Should he use this ring? It felt too sacred, too meaningful. But then he thought of Arabella, how she had been a part of his every year, how her presence had shaped his life even without her knowing. He decided yes. That ring symbolized true commitment. And if he was going to do this, he would do it with his whole heart. By late morning, they were ready. Remy hitched the horse to the small buggy, helping Arabella climb aboard. Their shoulders brushed as they sat side by side. Neither spoke for a while, the steady rhythm of hooves and the rustle of autumn leaves filling the silence. The journey to town was short, but the air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. Arabella glanced at him now and then, at his strong hands holding the reins, at the familiar profile she'd seen for decades but never really looked at until now. She wondered how many times she had turned to him for comfort, for laughter, for friendship, and how blind she had been to the deeper kind of care that had always lingered in his eyes. When they arrived at the courthouse, it was nearly noon. The town was quiet, the streets lined with trees just beginning to shed their orange and gold leaves. Inside, the courthouse was simple and small, sunlight streaming through tall windows that made dust motes dance in the air. A kindly justice of the peace greeted them, along with two witnesses, a young court clerk and the elderly janitor who had been sweeping the floor moments earlier. Arabella's hands trembled slightly as she stood beside Remy. The justice opened his book and began the brief ceremony. Do you, Arabella Hayes, take Remy Bradford to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and keep him in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? Arabella looked up at Remy, really seeing him for the first time. She saw the boy who once read poetry with her under the oak tree, the man who comforted her when her mother passed away, the friend who never once failed her. Her eyes welled up. I do, she said, her voice cracking slightly. Then it was Remy's turn. Do you, Remy Bradford, take Arabella Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love, honor, and keep her, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? His answer came without hesitation. I do. He had waited 40 years to say those words, and they felt like both a beginning and an ending all at once. The justice nodded approvingly. The rings, please. Remy took his father's gold band from his pocket and slid it gently onto Arabella's finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her. It knows what commitment looks like, he murmured. Arabella blinked back tears. When the justice declared, You may kiss your bride, Remy hesitated, looking into her eyes, silently asking permission. She gave a small, nervous nod. The kiss was soft and brief, but it sent a quiet current through both of them, something neither had expected. When they pulled apart, both were breathless, not from passion, but from the realization of what had just changed between them forever. The court clerk dabbed at her eyes. That was beautiful, she said softly. They signed the marriage papers in silence. Arabella stared at her new name on the certificate, Arabella Bradford. It looked strange, yet somehow right. Remy watched her, his heart caught somewhere between joy and fear. As they stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight, the crisp air felt different, charged with something new. Arabella stopped on the courthouse steps and turned to him. I don't know how to be a wife to you, she said quietly, eyes full of honesty and uncertainty. We've been friends so long, I don't even know what this means. Remy's chest tightened, but he forced a reassuring smile. He offered her his arm. Then we'll figure out together, he said gently. She hesitated, then took his arm, the warmth of his hand steady beneath hers. They walked toward the waiting buggy, the golden leaves swirling around them. Neither of them spoke of the kiss that still lingered on their lips, or of the love that neither had yet dared to name. Deep down, both knew this was only the beginning, and that the hardest part was still to come. The ride home was a quiet one, the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves echoing in the stillness. Each mile between the courthouse and the farmhouse stretching out like a vast silence. Arabella sat beside Remy, her hand resting near his, but neither of them moved to close the distance. The weight of the day hung between them, an invisible barrier neither could cross. The sun had climbed higher, casting its warmth over the autumn landscape, but the chill from the wedding ceremony, the vows spoken in haste, still lingered. Arabella's mind raced as she stared out at the passing fields, the bright leaves swirling in the breeze. She had married Remy, yes, but there was so much more to this than the legal contract they just signed. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but this uneasy silence, wasn't it? She couldn't help but feel out of place, as if this marriage, this union, was some strange, foreign thing she was stumbling through. Beside her, Remy drove the buggy with steady hands, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking at her, his eyes fixed ahead, but she felt his presence beside her, the tension in his shoulders. They were married now, a husband and wife, but neither knew what to do next. She had packed so much in her trunk, and yet it felt like she was leaving behind a part of herself in the town, a life that no longer seemed to fit. Where should I put my things?" she asked, her voice small, almost uncertain. Remy stood silently for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Finally, he looked at her and said, "The main bedroom. You're my wife now." His voice held a note of finality, but it wasn't harsh. It was simply the truth. Arabella blushed at the words, unsure of how to respond. She had known this was where things were headed, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel real in a way she hadn't expected. "Remy, I don't expect," she started, but he interrupted her gently. "I'll take the spare room. Unless, until, if you ever." His voice trailed off, a sudden vulnerability in his words that made her pause. He was offering her space, time, and yet she could hear the unspoken plea behind his words. She nodded, the relief and disappointment mixing in her chest. It was as if the whole thing had come to a halt right before it even started. But the truth was, neither of them had any idea how to begin this marriage, this life together. The evening was quiet, as it always was on the farm, but the silence between them felt different now. Arabella moved into the main bedroom, laying out her things with a kind of mechanical detachment. She pulled open the drawer in the old wooden dresser and found something unexpected: letters. Her letters. They were tied with a faded ribbon, yellowed with age. She stared at them, a rush of emotions flooding her chest. These were the letters she had written to Remy over the years, letters she had thought lost, forgotten in time. She hadn't known he had kept them, hadn't known that the words she had shared with him had meant so much. There were so many things she had said in those letters that she had never said aloud. Fears, regrets, even hopes for the future. She ran her fingers over the delicate paper, the ink faded but still legible. The years had passed, and so much had changed. But Remy had kept them all, a quiet testament to their friendship. She felt a tightness in her chest, a deep, painful longing for something she couldn't quite put into words. Downstairs, Remy was cooking, his tall form bent over the stove. The smell of stew and fresh-baked bread drifted up the stairs, a comforting, familiar scent that made her stomach growl. She took a deep breath and descended, her feet light as she stepped into the kitchen. Remy looked up at her, his expression soft, his hands moving deftly as he stirred the pot. "You don't have to do that. Let me," she started, but he waved her off with a small smile. "We'll do it together," he said simply, the warmth in his voice grounding her. They worked side by side, preparing the meal in companionable silence. It felt natural, as if they had done this 1,000 times before, even though they hadn't. The small touches, hands brushing as they reached for the same spoon, their hips grazing as they moved around the kitchen, were innocent, yet they carried a kind of electric charge neither of them knew how to handle. It was both thrilling and awkward, familiar and entirely new. Dinner was simple, but it was delicious. They sat down at the small kitchen table, the warmth of the food comforting in the midst of the tension. Remy said grace, his voice steady and sure, then added softly, And thank you for bringing Arabella home." Arabella's eyes filled with tears at the word home. She had never considered Remy's farmhouse her home before, but now it was. And yet, it felt like she was still standing at the edge of something, waiting for a sign, a clue, something to tell her what to do next. As they ate in silence, she noticed something that made her throat tighten. He had made her favorite stew. "You remembered," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Remy's gaze met hers, and the weight of his words hung in the air between them. "I remember everything about you," he said simply. It was true. All these years, every small detail had been etched into his memory. And now, with her sitting across from him at this table, he couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something he had waited for. As they finished the meal, Arabella stood and started clearing the table. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, her hand resting on the railing. "Remy," she said quietly, "thank you. For today. For everything." He was standing by the fire, the light from the lamp casting shadows across his face. "Arabella, you should know," he began, but before he could finish, she was already climbing the stairs. Her heart was racing, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. Remy's voice followed her, soft and almost inaudible. "I love you. I've always loved you." The words echoed in her mind as she froze on the landing. For a long moment, she didn't move. She didn't come back down. Instead, she stood there, her hand clutching the banister, her heart torn between wanting to say something and being too scared to acknowledge the truth that now hung in the air between them. The first morning after their wedding felt like the world had shifted beneath Arabella's feet, and she wasn't sure she was ready to stand on the new ground. She hadn't slept much, the quiet of the house unfamiliar, and the lingering words of Remy from the night before. The confession he hadn't meant to say, the one she'd overheard, echoed in her mind like an unanswered prayer. When she finally slipped out of bed, the sun had barely risen, and the house was still wrapped in that soft morning glow that made everything seem gentle and peaceful, though inside, her heart was anything but. She moved down the stairs as quietly as she could, trying not to wake Remy. But she found him already up, his boots by the door, the smell of fresh coffee filling the kitchen. He was standing at the stove, his broad back to her as he worked, his movements steady and sure. He looked just as he always did, but somehow everything was different now. They were married. He was her husband. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this uneasy sense of waiting. She stepped into the kitchen, and he turned when he heard her, giving her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning," he said quietly. Arabella nodded, unsure what to say next. She watched him as he placed a plate of eggs on the table, his hands moving with a practiced ease that had always been part of him. He had always been the steady one, the rock she had leaned on for so many years, and yet now, in this new chapter of their lives, she wasn't sure where she fit. "I made breakfast," he said, offering her a chair at the table. "I wasn't sure what you'd want, but I thought eggs would be safe." Arabella sat down, grateful for the simple gesture, but the words she had heard him whisper the night before, "I love you. I've always loved you," hung heavy between them. He hadn't meant for her to hear that. She knew it, and yet it was there, in the silence of the morning, in a way they both avoided looking at each other too long. The awkwardness of the moment was like a wall between them, and she wasn't sure how to break it down. They ate in silence, the sound of their forks clinking against their plates the only noise filling the room. Arabella kept stealing glances at him, trying to make sense of her feelings. She wanted to say something, anything to fill the space between them, but the words stuck in her throat. After breakfast, Remy stood up to clear the table, but Arabella stopped him. "Let me," she said quickly, not wanting him to feel like he had to do everything. "I'll do it." Remy nodded, his expression unreadable. He stepped away from the table and moved toward the door. "I'm going out to the fields," he said. "I'll be back in a while." Arabella nodded, watching him go. She wasn't sure what to do with herself. This was her new life, and yet it felt so strange. Everything was different and nothing at the same time. She stood there for a moment, lost in her thoughts. What had she expected from marriage? She had come to Remy out of necessity, out of desperation, but the truth was she had never imagined this. This quiet, steady life, this slow unfolding of emotions she didn't know how to deal with. She thought about the letters she had found the night before, the ones she had written to him over the years, never knowing he had kept them. She wondered if he had always felt the way he had whispered that night. Had he loved her for all these years? And if so, why hadn't he said anything? And now that they were married, what was she supposed to do with the truth of it all? She couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake. Not because she didn't care for Remy, but because everything had happened so fast. And because she wasn't sure if she could be the kind of wife he needed. When Remy returned from the fields, Arabella was in the living room, sitting by the window and watching the world outside. He paused in the doorway, looking at her with a mixture of hesitation and longing, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I'm going to start on the hay today," he said. "You can help if you want. It's a lot of work, but it's better with two people." Arabella looked up, surprised. "I've never worked on a farm before," she said, her voice uncertain. Remy smiled, his eyes softening. "I'll show you. It's not as hard as it looks." And just like that, he offered her a way in, a way to become part of the life he had built here, even if it was a life she had never known. Arabella nodded and stood up. "Okay, I'll help." They spent the rest of the day working together in the fields, the air warm with the scent of hay and earth. Arabella fumbled at first, her hands not used to the rough work, but Remy was patient, showing her how to bundle the hay, how to tie the ropes, and how to carry the heavy bales without straining her back. As they worked, the awkwardness between them began to fade. They found a rhythm, moving side by side as the day passed. She laughed when her bonnet blew off in the wind, and Remy caught it with a gentle hand. The moment stretched out, the air thick with unspoken words. He returned her bonnet to her, his hand lingering on hers just a second too long, and Arabella's heart skipped in her chest. There was something between them, something that had always been there, but was now beginning to surface. She felt it, too, even though she wasn't ready to face it. She wasn't ready to name it. Later that evening, after a long day of work, they sat together at the small kitchen table, sharing a simple meal. Arabella noticed how Remy's eyes followed her as she moved around the room. She couldn't help but wonder if he was thinking the same thing she was. If they could really make this work, if they could turn this marriage of necessity into something real. When they finished eating, Remy stood and began clearing the dishes, but Arabella stopped him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For today. For everything." Remy looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "I'm glad you're here." His words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, everything else fell away. It wasn't love yet, not the way she had imagined it, but it was something real. And for the first time since their wedding, Arabella felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her place in this life she had chosen. Sunday morning came with a gentle breeze and a quiet stillness that seemed to hang in the air like the calm before a storm. Arabella had never been particularly fond of church, but today she dressed in her best dress, a simple black one that seemed too formal for the occasion, but also too casual for what had just happened between her and Remy. They had spent the week working together, talking here and there, but always with the shadow of their marriage hanging between them, unspoken but undeniable. As they prepared to head to church, she felt the weight of it all, this marriage, this new life, bearing down on her. When they arrived, the old wooden church stood in the middle of the town, its steeple stretching toward the sky like a silent witness to the passage of time. They walked inside, the familiar scent of wood and wax mingling with the sound of footsteps on the creaky floorboards. The congregation greeted them with smiles and nods, but Arabella could feel their eyes on them, watching with quiet curiosity. It was as if everyone already knew something she didn't, something about her and Remy. She felt exposed under their gaze, the weight of their unspoken questions pressing down on her. They sat together in the pew, and Arabella couldn't help but notice the way Remy's hand subtly brushed against hers, a small gesture that sent a jolt through her chest. She tried to focus on the service, on the comforting words of the minister, but her mind kept drifting back to their wedding, to the kiss that had felt more like a promise than an obligation. As the service ended, the women of the congregation surrounded Arabella, congratulating her with warm smiles and kind words. "You married a good man," one of them said, her voice full of admiration. "Thomas has always had such a soft spot for you." Arabella froze at the mention of Remy's old name, a slip of the tongue that made her heart stumble in her chest. "Thomas?" she repeated, her voice shaky. "Who is Thomas?" The older woman chuckled softly. "That's what we've always called him. We figured you'd figure it out sooner or later. Remy's real name is Thomas Bradford, but I guess he likes Remy better. He's always been quiet, very reserved." Arabella felt the color drain from her face as she processed this new piece of information. Remy had never told her his full name. She had never asked. It seemed trivial at the time, but now, in the midst of the quiet scrutiny of the town, it felt like one more thing she didn't know about him. She had spent 40 years in his company, yet here she was, still learning things about him that should have been known. As the morning wore on, they walked home together, the sun warm on their backs, and the leaves still falling gently from the trees. Arabella could feel the weight of the town's gossip swirling around them, a quiet hum that only grew louder the further they went. "Why didn't you ever tell me, Remy?" she asked, her voice catching as she turned to look at him. His face remained unreadable, but she could see the flicker of something behind his eyes. Something guarded, something he didn't want her to see. "Tell you what?" he asked, his tone light, almost dismissive. "That you love me. Before David. Before I wasted 25 years. His footsteps faltered, and for a brief moment, Arabella could feel the walls between them growing taller, as if the town's eyes were the only thing keeping them apart. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice low, but not angry. Just tired. She shook her head, unable to put her feelings into words. She had known. In some way, she had always known. But it had taken her until now to admit it. "I heard you that first night. By the stairs," she whispered. His silence was deafening, and for a long time, neither of them said anything. The weight of the past hung heavy on them both, and it was as if all the unspoken feelings, all the years of friendship, had suddenly come rushing to the surface. "I didn't tell you because you were happy with him," Remy said at last, his voice rough, almost apologetic. "Or I thought you were." Arabella's throat tightened as she processed his words. She had never known how much he had suffered in silence, how much he had held back for her sake, thinking she was happy with David. But she hadn't been happy. Not truly. David had been cold, distant, everything she had been told to expect in a marriage. And Remy, all this time, had been the one who had always been there, waiting in the wings, offering his quiet support without ever asking for anything in return. She had seen him as a friend, a steady presence, but never as the man who had loved her all along. "I was never happy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He married me for status. But you," she faltered, unsure of how to say the words. Remy's eyes softened as he turned to her. "It's all right, Arabella. I accepted it when I agreed to marry you." His words cut through her like a blade, and for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. He had accepted it. He had accepted her, even though he knew she wasn't fully his, even though he had always known that she could never love him the way he had loved her. "But it's not all right, Remy," she said, her voice rising now. "You deserve someone who loves you, not someone who's using you." "You think I don't know the difference?" He shot back, his tone sharper now. "I've always known the difference. I've loved you through all of it, through your marriage to someone else, through the years we spent apart, through everything." His words struck her like a slap. And for a moment, Arabella felt like everything inside her was unraveling. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I'm saying that I've waited for you, Arabella. I've waited for 40 years to tell you how I feel, and I'm not going to waste any more time." Arabella's breath caught in her throat as she looked into his eyes, finally seeing the truth of everything he had hidden for so long. The love, the devotion, the quiet patience. She had been blind to it, too busy living her own life to notice that the man who had always been there for her was the one who had loved her all along. "I don't know how to do this, Remy," she whispered. "I don't know how to love you the way you deserve." He took a step closer, his hand reaching out to cup her face gently. "We'll figure out together, Arabella. I've waited 40 years. I can wait longer." And in that moment, Arabella realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something more than she had ever imagined. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were still so many things they needed to work through. But for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, love was still within reach. The weeks following their emotional conversation had been a mix of quiet moments and tentative steps towards something neither Arabella nor Remy had fully understood. They had settled into a routine of sorts, though it wasn't the kind of routine either had expected. It was strange at first, awkward even, as they both navigated the delicate balance of being husband and wife while still clinging to the friendship they had built over 40 years. Each day, Remy seemed to grow more patient, more gentle in his way with her, as if he was savoring every small moment they shared. It was in the way he left wildflowers on her breakfast plate, in the way he held her hand just a little longer when they walked side by side through the fields, in the way he watched her as though she was the most precious thing in his world. Arabella couldn't help but notice these things, and with each passing day, the wall she had built around her heart began to crack. She had always seen him as a friend, a steady presence in her life, but now she was starting to see him differently. He wasn't just Remy anymore. He wasn't just the man who had been there when she needed him. He was someone more. The shift was subtle at first, but it was undeniable. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Remy handed her a small, crumpled piece of paper. She took it hesitantly, unfolding it to find the words of a poem scrawled in his unmistakable handwriting. It wasn't a great poem, far from it, but the words were heartfelt, the sentiments raw and unpolished. "I know it's not much," he said, his voice quiet, almost shy, "but I've been thinking about you, about us, and I wanted you to know." Arabella stared at the poem for a long moment, feeling a strange twist in her chest. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her heart ache. For the first time, she saw just how much Remy had been carrying all these years, how much he had silently longed for her. The realization hit her like a wave, and before she knew what she was doing, she leaned over and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of desperation or urgency. It was gentle, soft, as if they were both testing the waters of something neither of them fully understood. But when their lips met, something changed between them. It wasn't just the kiss itself, but the understanding that came with it. It was the acknowledgement that they were no longer just two people who had been friends for 40 years. They were something more now, something that had the potential to become even deeper, even more meaningful. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of energy, a new kind of intimacy that neither of them had expected. They still worked together, side by side in the fields, but now there was a different kind of connection between them. It wasn't just the physical closeness of their work. It was something that went deeper, a shared understanding that they were both changing in ways they hadn't expected. They talked more in the evenings, sitting by the fire or walking through the orchard, sharing stories about their pasts, their hopes, their dreams. It was in these quiet moments that Arabella began to see Remy for the man he truly was. He wasn't just the man who had always been there for her. He was someone with a quiet strength, a deep well of love that he had kept hidden for so long. And she wasn't just the woman who had married him out of necessity. She was beginning to realize that she had always loved him in her own way. It wasn't a love that had bloomed overnight, but a love that had grown quietly over the years, nurtured by their friendship and by the small moments they had shared. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Remy reached over and took her hand, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. Arabella looked at him, her heart skipping a beat at the simple gesture. She had spent so many years denying the feeling she had for him, convinced that their friendship was enough. But now, with him sitting beside her, so close and yet so far away, she knew that it was more than enough. "I've loved you for a long time, Remy," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the admission. "I just didn't know it until now." Remy's gaze softened, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I know," he replied quietly. "I've always known." They didn't say anything else for a long time, simply sitting in the silence, letting the truth settle between them. It wasn't a grand confession. It wasn't the passionate declaration of love that she had imagined when she was younger. But it was real, more real than anything she had ever felt. Their relationship had always been built on a foundation of friendship, and now it was growing into something deeper, something neither of them could have anticipated. As the weeks passed, the changes in their relationship became more and more evident. They began to court each other in small ways, leaving little notes for one another, sharing quiet moments in the evenings, and learning to be vulnerable in ways they hadn't before. Remy, who had always been so reserved, was slowly opening up, sharing more of himself with her than he ever had. Arabella, in turn, found herself doing the same. She was beginning to let go of the fear that had held her back for so long, the fear that she wasn't enough, that she couldn't give Remy the kind of love he deserved. In the midst of all this change, Arabella realized that she was no longer just playing a role in a marriage that had started out of necessity. She was becoming a wife in the truest sense of the word, and she was beginning to understand what it meant to love someone not just because you had to, but because you wanted to. As they sat together one night, watching the firelight flicker in the hearth, Remy turned to her and smiled. "I never thought this would be our life," he said softly, "but I'm glad it is." Arabella smiled back, her heart swelling with a quiet contentment she hadn't known was possible. "Me too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Me too." The morning of their one-year anniversary dawned as quietly as any other. But for Arabella, it felt like the world had shifted in ways she never could have imagined when she first stepped onto Remy's porch that fateful night. She woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window, the soft glow of morning light spilling across the room. Remy was still asleep beside her, his arm draped lightly across her waist, the warmth of his body a steady comfort. She stretched slowly, taking in the peacefulness of the moment, the simple happiness of waking up beside the man she had married. She had never thought it would feel like this calm, this content. She had spent so many years running from her own feelings, from the quiet love that had always been there. But now, here, in this bed, she finally understood. She finally understood the depth of her own heart. She slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to disturb him, and padded quietly to the kitchen. The house was still, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards under her feet. She made coffee, the smell filling the small kitchen, and poured herself a cup as she sat at the table, looking out the window at the fields beyond. The past year had been nothing like she had expected. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, but there had also been so much love, small, steady love that had been built brick by brick. She had married Remy for reasons that seemed simple at the time, but in the months that followed, she had come to realize that this was no longer a marriage of convenience. It was a marriage of choice, a marriage of love, and she had chosen him. The door creaked open behind her, and Remy appeared, his hair mussed from sleep, his shirt untucked. He walked over to her and kissed the top of her head before sitting down across from her. "Happy anniversary," he said softly, his voice still thick with sleep. She smiled at him, feeling a warmth in her chest. "Happy anniversary," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. It had only been a year, but it felt like a lifetime in the best possible way. Remy reached across the table, taking her hand in his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low, "that we should renew our vows today. Just the two of us, no one else." Arabella's heart swelled at his words. They had already been married for a year, but there was something so deeply intimate about the idea of standing before him again, exchanging vows that weren't born out of obligation, but out of true love. She nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "I'd like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I like that very much." They spent the morning in quiet conversation, the comfort of each other's presence filling the spaces between them. Later, they walked together to the small church on the property, just the two of them. There were no guests, no elaborate ceremony, just the two of them standing before the altar. Arabella wore the same simple dress she had worn the first time they married, a symbol of how far they had come together. She had never imagined that this simple life, this quiet love, would be the one that filled her heart to the brim. But here she was, standing beside Remy, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. They stood together, hands clasped, as the minister spoke words that felt familiar but new at the same time. When it was time to exchange vows, Arabella stepped forward, her voice steady as she spoke the words that had been in her heart for so long. "Remy, 40 years ago I met my best friend," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "1 year ago, I married him." She took a deep breath, holding his gaze as she continued. "Today, I choose him with full knowledge and full heart. You taught me that love doesn't shout, it stays. And I promise to love you loudly from now on." Remy's eyes were soft as he listened, and when it was his turn to speak, his voice was thick with emotion. "Arabella, I loved you in silence for 40 years, he said, his hand tightening around hers. "But silence is over. You are my beginning, my middle, my end. Every day with you is the life I dreamed of, and I promise to keep choosing you until my last breath." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was nothing else in the world but the two of them, standing in that small church, surrounded by their quiet love. The minister pronounced them husband and wife once again, and this time, when they kissed, it was different. It wasn't the hesitant, uncertain kiss of their first marriage. It wasn't born out of necessity or obligation. It was a kiss of pure, unspoken love, a kiss that spoke of everything they had been through together and everything they still had ahead of them. As they left the church hand in hand, the sun shone down on them, the sky clear and bright. Arabella felt a sense of peace settle over her, a peace that had eluded her for so many years. She had spent so long wondering if she had made the right choice, if this life with Remy was what she truly wanted. But now, as she stood beside him, she knew without a doubt that this was where she was meant to be. This was home. They walked back to the farmhouse together, the evening air cool against their skin, and as they reached the porch, Remy paused and turned to her. "No regrets?" he asked, his voice full of quiet hope. She smiled, the weight of the last year lifting off her shoulders. "Only that I didn't tell you at 18, she replied, her heart full. "We found our way," she added, leaning into him. 40 years of friendship made us ready for forever. He pulled her close, and they stood together in the fading light of the day, a quiet understanding between them. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Their story, so long in the making, had finally come full circle.